All right. Welcome, everybody, to the November 2020 Crystal Ball webinar. We're also going to be talking about some of the future LSATs that are coming up in 2021 as well. So I am joined here tonight by Jon Denning and Adam Tyson. And I am Dave Killoran, and Jon and I are going to be running the webinar tonight and occasionally pitching in on the chat. And Adam is going to be helping out on the chat as well. Probably the best pre-webinar chat that I've seen so far. Certainly the most interesting one from my perspective. A lengthy discussion there. So normally, if you're a podcast listener, you know that Jon and I like to have a drink of the night. Because this is live, we have to be a little bit more careful. So I'm just drinking that Monster Zero Ultra Energy. I'm not sure what Jon's drinking. Maybe he will share that a little bit later. And I'm sure that Adam is drinking a beer of some sort since that is his preferred beverage. But there is a lot to cover tonight, so I want to jump right into the discussion. And part of what we do in the Crystal Ball is we try to predict what you're going to see on upcoming LSATs. And some of that can be very generalized, to talk about the content that is on every LSAT, and sometimes it's very specific. And I think tonight you'll see that we get a little bit more specific than on some prior occasions that we've done this. So as we start off here, let's go ahead and take a look at the upcoming LSATs in very brief overview kind of format here. You've got the next 4 tests listed out in this top row. So there's a test coming up in November, and I know a bunch of people in here are going to be taking that test. So this will certainly apply in great measure to that exam. And then we've got exams coming up in January, February, and April. And as I think most people are aware at this particular point, all of these tests are in the Flex format. So I will talk about that in just a moment, but for the time being, the next 4 LSATs, at least, maybe more in 2021, but we don't know yet, will be in the Flex format. And you can see the days of the week change depending upon the test administration. And what's really controlling here is the size of the test, how many people are actually taking it. This November test is fairly substantial in size. That will actually affect some of the predictions that we make later on, whereas January, February, and April are all a lot smaller, and so those are only on Saturday and Sunday. And you look at that November test, and you can see it is Saturday to Wednesday. So more days for that exam compared to the later ones. Now, the tests run on the same exact hours no matter what day it is. It's basically 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern. You go in and select your time slot through ProctorU. They come up in 20-minute increments. There's plenty of spaces at each time, so usually there's not an issue with not being able to get the time that you want. The score release runs about 17 to 19 days after the test starts. So you can see all those dates there. I will tell you this, after you take this test in November, November 24th is going to seem like a long, long way off. So we'll just have to wait through it and talk about how the exam went afterwards, which will hopefully help everybody feel a little bit more comfortable as they wait until score release. This next row, very interesting one. Usually, the people who make this test, LSAC, release 3 tests a year. This past year, as we discovered, they weren't planning on releasing any, and then we were able to squeeze one out. But when they don't release the exams, they're known as non-disclosed tests. And what that means is that you don't get a copy of the test or the answers. You just get your score for the most part. That actually does have some impact on future LSATs because it allows them to reuse these tests. And as we will find, non-disclosed tests can play a really big role in certain LSATs, and we think it will play a big role in this LSAT. And then last, looking at the admissions timeline and thinking about for fall 2021. We saw an interesting conversation in the lead up to this webinar in the chat about Canadian students versus, American or applying to American law school students. And one of the things that you see is that a lot of Canadian schools have much earlier deadlines. So when we say schools accept, what we are referring to is primarily the U.S. law schools here. Every U.S. law school except November 7th almost all of them will accept January. I think it's Stanford and maybe one other in the top 14 that don't. And then many of the schools will accept the February test, Duke, for example, and even some schools will accept April. And depending upon how this cycle goes, we may see some of these deadlines get pushed back. This has been something that's happened in recent years where we have noticed that a school says, well, we'll stop at January, and then you talk to them in January and they're like, well, we're going to take February or March or whatever the case may be. So these are not hard, fast deadlines for a lot of schools. Sometimes they do change. So as we look towards the next 4 LSATs, that's kind of like the basic overview. That's the position that we have to deal with as we look at this. And this crystal ball webinar is primarily focused on the first couple of tests. We will see what happens though, because as they make certain decisions, it affects the future exams. And so we will talk about that. As far as tonight, let's take a look at what we're actually going to cover. And there are 3 main areas that we want to get into tonight. The first one is we want to talk a little bit about the LSAT-Flex format. We're not going to go into great detail here. It's just going to take a few minutes. But we really need to make sure that everybody is on the same page as far as understanding what the test experience is like. Some of you veterans out there are like, I already know that. But there are plenty of new people that will be listening to this and seeing it, and we need to make sure that everybody understands how the format of the test works. Then we're going to kind of cover the individual test sections and the content that we see with those. And we'll talk about certain things like question types in logical reasoning or game types in logic games that we know are actually going to appear. All right, then we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the scoring scale for this test, the way the Flex works at least, as well as the 5 Flex administrations we've had so far and what we've learned from that in terms of the way the tests are curved, the type of content that we've seen, and we're going to make predictions in terms of what we think we're going to see and where they're going to draw the next test and the next several tests from. And I think for many people, that is something they find really useful because it allows you to shape your studying and kind of focus on certain areas of prep tests and avoid others. And there might be some things you want to go look at after we talk about this as well. And then once the main portion of the seminar is over, we will open the floor to questions and just kind of take those casually and see what people are interested in and see if there's anything that we didn't cover that there are questions about. So with that format in mind and understanding these are the 4 upcoming Flex tests, let's do a brief dive into what the Flex format is all about. So when we look at this, there's only 3 sections. There's 1 of each type: logical reasoning, logic games, and reading comprehension. And this means, just on that basis, because there used to be 2 logical reasoning sections, that logical reasoning is a little bit less important, and logic games and reading comprehension are a little bit more important. Now, sometimes people have said, well, do they double logical reasoning? They do not. In fact, as the 3rd bullet point notes, all questions are scored and weighted equally. So all of a sudden, since you have only 74 to 76 questions total, and reading comprehension has the majority of questions, reading comprehension has just become, by a nose, the most important section. Then logical reasoning is the 2nd most important, and then logic games, in terms of actual absolute weight, is the least important. Now, I can say this, that you can talk about numerical weighting all you want, but I know for many people, the logic game section is still the most important, because if it doesn't go well, they're going to feel that the test didn't go well. Or it might be reading comprehension. It depends upon your section skills. But what this means is this is a slightly different test than the standard LSAT, which is a longer exam that has more logical reasoning in it. One thing that is the same, however, is that the scores are still produced on a 120 to 180 scale. And every law school that we have talked to, and it's pretty much almost, I think it's all of them at this point, has said, we don't care whether it's a Flex LSAT or a regular LSAT, we are going to take it and we are going to compare students apples to apples and not worry about it one way or the other. So the scaling of these exams has been a hotly debated question. John and I talk about it probably daily, and if not daily, it's every other day. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this seminar. John's going to go into detail on that, so I will leave that to him. But the scoring for a flex exam is very unique because of the differences that we see listed above. Let's talk briefly about the test administration and kind of an overview of how that works. First off, for a lot of people, this is a really nice thing. It's at home. Not everybody loves that, but if it was me, I would love it, and I know a lot of people do. You can take it in the so-called comfort of your own home. Hopefully, your roommates or your parents or your brother or sister are not screaming during that, or the cat doesn't go crazy, or the garbage truck outside isn't going to make a lot of noise. But you can pick your time to try and avoid that. How do they deliver the test? They deliver it using LSAC's standard digital testing interface, which is very similar to what you see on the Law Hub interface, very similar to what you see with our analytics package that has all the LSATs on it as well. When you take the exam, it is administered not by LSAC, but by a service called ProctorU. And they end up having live proctors who check you in and observe you, so to speak, during the test. Now, in a lot of cases, that one proctor is maybe working with 100 different people, so they're not watching every move you make. So if you get that kind of like creepy crawly feeling where somebody's watching you, don't worry about it. They're probably watching a whole bunch of different things and not paying a whole lot of attention to you. But ProctorU is an interesting service because a lot of the problems that students have had with this test have been because of ProctorU and issues with various proctors. So we always say at the beginning of the test, establish a good rapport with that proctor and make sure they understand the importance of the exam, not to bother you if possible, and to stop the clock if anything does in fact come up. You can take this on any desktop or laptop that is running Windows or Macintosh OS. So you've got a wide variety of devices. You can't take it on your phone, but you can take it on tablets. In fact, if you don't have a machine, LSAC will send you one. So you can request that. And if you don't have a place to take the test that's quiet or has reliable internet, you can request a hotel voucher from LSAC, and they will in fact provide that as well. So they've done their best to try to make all of this available. And for those who need accommodations, they are still completely in effect. The digital interface actually handles quite a bit of the accommodations in terms of text sizing, different colors, and what have you. But you can also request a paper and pencil accommodation, and they will do that for you as well. So this test offers a lot of the similar options. It's just primarily at home. Let's talk a little bit about what you can have with you and a little bit about the security of this test. So you got to have a webcam, and that's so they can take a look at you and make sure that you're not getting up to leave or anything like that. And that webcam is also used for the check-in that you do, and the check-in is very important. One of the things I always remind students is don't forget your ID and show it to the camera very clearly. It cannot be a military ID. They will not accept that. They will not let you go forward with the test, and that is because military IDs cannot be photographed. Also, no one else can be in the room. Now, your dog can be in the room, your cat can be in the room, your parakeet can be in the room, although I'm not sure I would make that call myself, but you can't have a friend sitting nearby. If somebody walks in for just a second, that won't be a big deal, but they don't want somebody sitting there permanently, and they won't allow that. There's also no talking or reading aloud. So we get a question quite frequently that says, well, I talk to myself. It's been hit or miss with this. If you talk to yourself, keep it really, really quiet because they really want no talking whatsoever. The reason for that is because they don't want you to read the test aloud and have that recorded by a device in the room. So yes, this is an anti-cheating method. I think it's a little extreme, but there it is anyway. So take that for what it actually is. There's also a whole host of other things that are outlawed here. There's no getting up. You can't walk around and stand up and stretch out or anything like that. You can't wear a hoodie for the most part. You can't get up and go to the bathroom, which I think is ridiculous, but that's the rule. Again, anti-cheating. You can't have a smartwatch on. a lot of these things, if they happen, they review it and it turns out not to be a huge issue. For example, I've had students get up and all of a sudden realize I didn't mean to stand up and they sit back down. That doesn't cause a problem. If there is an issue, oftentimes you will see the proctor come in and take control and say, you can't do that, or I need to see your face in the screen, or whatever the case may actually be. There's basically 1-minute breaks between each section. There is no 10-minute break or 15-minute break the way you see on a traditional LSAT. When you get to the end of the first section, a timer will start counting down from 1 minute, which you would think to yourself, hey, I can go ahead and run to the bathroom. You cannot. You can take that minute to relax and think, but you can't do anything other than that. You can't move around. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are allowed. First off, you are allowed 5 sheets of blank scratch paper. It could also be lined, or it could be graph paper. So basically, you're allowed 5 pages of paper that have no written content on there. You're also allowed things such as soft foam earplugs. You can wear those, and that's been accepted, and that's because they realize, look, some people live in loud places, or there might be some type of noise around them. Now, you can't have, earbuds, for example, or anything like that. So you have to have the soft foam ones. They've given a little bit here, but they haven't been incredibly generous, I would say. Here's one that always comes up. Control F on a Windows machine or Command F on a Macintosh is in fact allowed. So you can use that function to search what is on the screen for a term. And most students who use this use it during reading comprehension. If they see a question that talks about centrism, they might search for that term and find all the references in the passage. And there's been a lot of uncertainty over this. I have talked to LSAC directly about this on multiple occasions. They do not care. They don't look for it. They don't flag it. They consider it to be a normal part of your browser functions. So if that's something that you'd like to use and think would be helpful, you can completely use that, and it's no issue whatsoever. And then the last thing, if there are any problems, they will flag it and take a look at it. Now, this is an interesting thing because on the LSAT itself, the flags haven't caused an issue. And usually what happens is the majority of people who are flagged, they never know anything about it. They get approved and it's okay. They just want to make sure that if you had a backpack in your room, for example, they want to make sure that you didn't access it. So that would cause you to get flagged, but then they would clear you through. The place that flags have actually caused an issue is in the LSAT writing, where the initial LSAT writing administration had over 50% rate of flagged sessions, and it caused all sorts of delays. And if any of you have taken a test before and had your score delayed because of LSAT writing, you know the pain that this caused. They've gotten better now, and certainly the rules have been well publicized, certainly by John and myself on our podcast, and now the rate is around 20%. So that is pretty helpful. And just one last comment, the last thing, you can use pen or pencil, so they do not care about that. So if you talk to a proctor, you don't need to ask for these things. They are explicitly allowed. And a lot of times if you ask a proctor, oh, can I have scratch paper? Their immediate response is no. Can I have earplugs? No. Can I have a pen? No. Because that's their default. So know this going in and you'll be a lot more comfortable. If you got a wall TV, it's okay. You don't have to, redo your entire room for it, but they're going to probably check your session to make sure that it was off. That would be the kind of thing they would look at for a flagged violation that would really not cause an issue. Issues are things they consider to be prejudicial to the security of the test. Having a smartwatch is one of those. Having your smartphone on the desk the entire time is another one. So you want to avoid things where they think you could be cheating in some particular way. So that's kind of a brief overview. If you're looking for more information on the way the LSAT-Flex works, I recommend that you check out some of our podcast episodes where we've gone into great detail about the rules and the things you have to watch out for and some of the experiences of various students. But as far as tonight's session, I think that's a pretty good synopsis of it. And what I want to do at this point is I want to move into actual test content. And so we're going to talk about the logical reasoning section, the reading comprehension section, and the logic game section in order here, and get into some details about predicting what is going to be on these upcoming LSATs and what you know you need to prepare for. So let's start with logical reasoning, and I'm going to let Jon take over and talk about that for a bit. Jon, all yours, buddy.
All right. Well, Dave, thank you very much. And hi, guys. There's a whole bunch of you here tonight. Thank you for joining us on a Monday evening. Dave's right. Obviously, everything that he has just covered, hugely important. Know this stuff. Take care of your environment. Know what to expect. Talk to your proctor beforehand. These are key ideas as to just simply how to have the best possible test day experience. But I have a suspicion as to why we're all really here. And that's to get some insights into what you expect to see and what we expect you to see on your upcoming exams. So everything that I'm about to talk to you about applies not only to this November test in about a week or so, but it's going to apply to the first three tests of 2021 as well. We all know them to be Flex, January, February, and April. This is going to be universally true unless we learn something in the interim about those tests as well. And we're going to start with logical reasoning, but let me give you guys a very quick preface to this as to how it is that we actually go about what we're about to do. I don't think I have to add credibility to it. Hopefully we have that already, but maybe a little bit of a curtain pull so you guys get to see how some of this sausage is truly made. What we do, guys, when we look at upcoming tests and try to anticipate what we expect to see, what we think the test makers are up to, is we take an incredibly detailed look, a scalpel view of the most recent test trends that we've seen. So we're going to actually run through this in a way with a historical type of perspective. We're going to talk about what's occurred over the last 3 years or so of released LSATs. And we're going to do it for each of the three scored sections on the Flex. We'll start with logical reasoning and then cover the other two. That's where we begin. But I have a bonus for you here tonight. We expected going into this, when we first announced that we were going to do this crystal ball, we really thought that the only source material we were going to have for this discussion was going to be the tests of 2017, 2018, 2019, the released exams that they have publicized, made public up to now. But about a week and a half, 2 weeks or so ago, we got an early Halloween treat, really, in the form of one of the tests that they actually used for the May 2020 Flex LSAT. We've got our hands on it. We have broken it down, and full credit to Dave for two reasons here. He's done most of the heavy lifting of the test deconstruction. I'm happy to admit that. I'm happy that he did it. But number two, I think Dave, modest as he sometimes is, could rightly claim some credit for the fact that this test actually came out. He's been leaning on the test makers here publicly in a few different forums, his Twitter, our podcasts, and it seems as though they've listened. They were not planning to release a test, to my knowledge, until Dave started making some noise, and now we have an entire new exam at our fingertips that we get to talk about tonight, too. So when we make these predictions, guys, I'm going to do it in two ways. I'm going to look at the tests that have most recently been available to us, and then I'm going to see how well our predictions, our analysis of those tests, applied to the May test that we now have. So you can actually see how this works in its application on the most recent thing that we've all got now. And if you haven't had a chance to look at this test, don't worry. We're not going to spoil it for you tonight. I know a lot of people are probably now planning to do May leading up to their real thing, as you should. So I won't say anything that's going to be too much of, I hope, a benefit or, like I said, a spoiler as we get into it. But you will get to see how some of these predictions come about and see them in play. Let's start with logical reasoning, and here we go. So what is it on your single logical reasoning section on your Flex test that you can more or less depend on by question type the role that each of these is going to play? What are the heavy hitters? What are the ones that tend to fade into some obscurity or perhaps non-existence? And I've broken them down for you here. So you see an entire column of what we would call frequent questions. These are questions that reliably appear typically 2 or more times, often 3 or 4 or more times per section. The big ones typically flaw, strengthen, and must be true, but I put must be true at the bottom here for a reason that I'll get to shortly. But these 4 questions alone, as you can see from the subpoint, account for about 50% of your score. They have historically, we expect them to continue to, so you must prioritize these 4 question types: flaw, strengthen, necessary assumption, and regular old must be true and most strongly supported. Those are the ones that you want to make sure you have locked down going into your test. There are some other questions, though, that can play a bigger or smaller role depending on the test itself. The biggest, most variable of this set is weaken. I've seen sections of logical reasoning with only 1 weaken. I've seen sections with up to 4. So weaken tends to really fluctuate. And I put must at the bottom of this frequent column because it could, in fact, straddle this fence, somewhere between frequent and variable. Must be true questions I've seen as many as 4 or 5 in a section. I've seen as few as, believe it or not, 0. So must tends to be on the whole a big deal, and obviously it's the heart of the LSAT when it comes to things like reading comprehension and even logic games. But in logical reasoning, it can really fluctuate. And then of course you've got the ones that traditionally routinely play much less of a role. Method argument part, evaluate and cannot, you may not see a single one of either on your test. And then justify, or what we would call, some people would call sufficient assumption. It tends to ride the fence here too. You might see 2 justify, you might see 1 or 0 in a single section. But that's the way these break out. So to put actual quantifiers on this, take a look at what a typical section would predictively, as we would predict it, look like. You can see the big boys up here at the top: flaw, must, strengthen up there competing with them, often for the lead. Sometimes strengthen gets into the 4 or even 5 range. And assumption tends to be a pretty stable presence, around 2 per section, 4 per test in the old days. It's sad for me to say that, but yeah, in the old days with 4 scored sections, you typically see about double of each of these numbers over an entire LSAT. You've got this middle group, again, fairly stable. Parallel and resolve, probably the 2 most stable here. And as I said, weaken, the most variable or the least predictable. Weaken can shrink, weaken can really grow. Hard to say section to section, even test to test. And then again, you've got these sort of small fries down at the bottom. Main point, 1, maybe 2 is typical. Method argument part, 1, maybe 2 total that you could see. Pointed issue can fluctuate. And then we even had to group those 2 very low-key players together to even get up to a total of 1 on average. But this is roughly what your section's going to look like. And if you do this by question count, guys, you can start to see flaw and must are about 8. Strengthen, that takes you to about 11. Assumption takes you to about 13. That's half your logical reasoning right there, again, in these 4 types. So the first time, or the last time really, we had this conversation, the first time we had it prior to any flex tests appearing was right before the May exam. And these were the numbers we predicted. These were the stats that we gave people and told them essentially to expect. How did they compare to the reality? So really putting our feet to the fire. Let's look at those relative to May. And I realize there's a whole bunch here. Let me explain. The orange bars that you see here are the May numbers. This is what we saw in the single section on the May Flex test that's been now released, as I said. The blue is the same as the last slide, and anything that you see in gray is when there's no difference. You still got both bars there in gray. But when they match, to just take your eye off of them a little more, we didn't highlight them. So we've highlighted any moment here where there's a discrepancy between our prediction and what actually happened in May. And you can see that most of these bars, as your eyes track down this, are pretty close together, if not, in many cases, identical. Flaw, we said they're usually about 4 per section. In May, there were actually 5. So flaw took a pretty commanding lead as the prime question type on this test. You've got things like strengthen. Again, we expect 3 or 4. We got 4 in May. Assumption, we expected 2. That's exactly how many that were there. But look at this guy. Look at old Must trying to be elusive, trying to avoid our close predictions. Usually there are 3 or 4 must per section. On the May test, the one section that was released, there was only a single must be true. What made up for this 3-question must swing from historical to May? If your eyes track down a little further, you'll find the culprit. It was weaken. Instead of there being only 1, 2, or maybe 3 weaken questions, there were 4. You'll recall that I said weaken was one of those variable types. Here's a classic example of why. We expected 2, We got twice as many in May. Justify, we expected 1 or 2, there were 2. Parallel and resolve, we said 2, there were 2 apiece. So this was a pretty good category or grouping, except for a week in there, which caught a lot of people off guard. Keep in mind one final thing about this too, guys. Remember, the statistics that we have always drawn from have been 2 sections of logical reasoning per test. When we look now at the Flex, we've only got one or the other of those 2 sections, which means this whole test with another logical reasoning might have actually averaged out with must to about a total of 6, 7, 8 questions, because we don't know what happened in the sister logical reasoning section that didn't appear on the Flex. Weaken, the other section might have only had 1. That would have averaged it back out to a pretty normal total amount. But in a single section, you start to see these variances really get exacerbated, really get magnified, because they don't have the offsetting balance of what has traditionally been a second LR. And then down here in the bottom, again, fairly standard, a single method of reasoning, argument part, no method, 2 main point, a little more pointed issue, and 0 cannot or evaluate questions. So a pretty low total. The last thing that I'll draw your attention to here, guys, by question type is, again, an actual tally. Look at the first 4 types up here. There were 5 flaw. Just 1 must, but we're at 6 now. 4 strengthen, so now we've got 10. 2 assumption. That's 12 questions. Again, right at about 50%. So guys, half of your logical reasoning score simply comes from your ability in flaw to describe a mistake, to describe an invalid argument. In must, to avoid 4 invalid arguments. That's all wrong answers are. Just things that aren't necessarily true from the premises. In strengthen, to spot an invalid argument and close the gap a little bit. And in assumption, to spot an invalid argument and try to keep it alive. That's it. That's really all that you're doing for 50% of your logical reasoning section. And granted, that's a distillation, but it's not a dumbing down. That's truly the goal here, the skill set. There's another way to group questions in logical reasoning, and that's by what we call family. This takes a broader view on the task itself as opposed to the specific question. So for instance, the first family of questions, this is things like flaw, main point, must be true, pointed issue, parallel reasoning. They all fit into this first family, and that roughly represents on most tests a little over half of what you will see. And sure enough, we predicted about 14 of the 26 questions would be of this type. Strengthen, assumption, resolve, justify, sufficient assumption. They're in the second family. We predicted another 9 or so. The third family has just 1 question type, again, weaken. That wild card of sorts that can really go up or down, but tends to balance out around 2. And then the fourth family cannot. Maybe 1, maybe 0. I didn't make any half bars in these charts, but if I had, cannot would be at about a half. Weaken would probably be about a 2.5, etc. Again, so you don't have to just take our historical word for it. What happened with these numbers in May? There they are. The first family, we expected 14. There were 13. The help family, we expected 9. There were exactly 9. The one thing, like I said, that caught us a little bit off guard, and certainly some test takers, was weaken. This one question type with the fluctuation. And like I said, maybe half would be where this bar should have been. On May, it was 0. So an extremely close match to both history and to our expectations. And guys, what I want you to take away from this then is not only can you tell how much they do tend to stick to these trends, subtle variation, but also how it is that you should begin to prioritize your efforts as you go. And to help you with those studies and improved understanding of these types, especially as you emphasize the most common stuff, we have recorded and put out a number of free resources. Let me give you a list of some. These are all podcast episodes, and if you want to take a picture with your phone or a screenshot if you're fancy, there you go. These are all podcast episodes that Dave and I have recorded specific to logical reasoning skills and specific to some of the biggest ideas. There's necessary assumptions, parallel. We had what was one of my favorite series arcs, if you could call it, On flaw in the reasoning, we did 4 episodes on flaw. We talked about common flaws for 3, and then we got into one of what I think is the most challenging aspects of flaw, the most common question type, which is what to do when you don't have a categorical mistake, when you can't call it by a known name. We gave you the skills, the strategies to solve those too. Excellent. Let's keep going. That's obviously only one of the 3 sections. Let's talk about what is the biggest section by volume or by contribution to your score, and that's reading comprehension. Again, historical tendencies, and then I'll apply them to May so you can see what's happened on the most recent thing that we have. Let's talk about passage types first, subject matter, really. And while this shouldn't necessarily have a big impact or influence on the nature of the passage or the difficulty of the passage, we all know, I think, that preferences exist. For instance, it's pretty well established, I much prefer a science passage to some soft humanities thing. I'd much rather read about dark holes and dark matter, or black holes and dark matter, than about some novel that was written in the 1800s. This is Victorian England. That's just my preference. Others are different. But this is roughly what you could or should expect to see. Half of your reading comp are going to be in some form of humanities, historical analysis, current trends. Sometimes it's economics, sometimes it's literature. One of the passages, no surprise for a LSAT, is on the law, typically. And again, it can be anything. Soft law, like courtrooms, very strict law, like legal judgments and precedents and things from court cases. And then science, again, a full range of science that you could see. Hard science, I mentioned a couple, quasars or neutrinos, things that most people have never heard of or don't understand. And then soft science, which is, global warming or something, or the moon's orbit, stuff that's a little more familiar, a little more common. Historically, 2017 through 2019, the release tests have broken down like the bullets here show. So, before May, going into that test, Dave and I did one of these. We showed this exact prediction. And what did we see in May? Exactly what we thought was coming. May had 2 passages that were humanities based. One about this trickster, picaresque Picaro passage. And again, I don't want to spoil this too much. Knowing the passage types won't ruin it for you. Another on plagiarism. A legal passage on corporate criminal liability, which apparently for a lot of people was tricky. And then the classic science passage. On this passage, it was about deep well injection, aquifers, I believe is what that was about, drilling. So there you go. Again, there's no guarantee that this is what you're going to see in November or next April, but it is a good bet. So this is what you need to be thinking about and expecting going in. Don't marry yourself to these expectations, but let them guide you. Use them as a North Star of sorts as you continue to study. They'll help you guide the way and point the way. What else do we see within reading comprehension sections? Well, it's not just passage type, guys. It's also question types. And if I were to separate these out, I don't know that I would treat all 3 of these equally. In fact, I think what I would probably do is I would split them into 2 instead. I tend to think of global reference questions, questions that are about the passage as a whole. What's the tone, the author's attitude, main point? What's the purpose or function? I tend to think of those as existing in their own little sphere of sorts, and the other 2 types below it, what we would call concept reference and specific reference, as things that are more targeted, narrower views, narrower looks at the passage, as you may have to go back and actually track down certain information or just focus piecemeal on portions. So as I look at this global reference, not quite half, there's usually 27 questions, we expected about 12. Concept and specific, we expected about 15 total. That was the breakdown. So collectively, these reference questions, the 2 that are narrower, are a little more than half, global a little less. We talked about this pre-May. What did we get? Again, pretty close if you take this from that same split that I had mentioned having before. The global reference, we thought there'd be 12. Turns out there were 11. Pretty close. 11 of the questions in the passages in May asked you simply to describe overall views of the passage or the author, him or herself. The narrower views, concept and specific. Concept, we thought there weren't going to be quite as many as there were. There were about 12 concept reference questions. That's on the high end. Specific, we thought there might be a few more than there were. There were only 4. That's on the low end. But collectively, what did we see? We thought there'd be 15. There were 16 total. So again, it goes to show not necessarily how good we are at this, although I'm happy to take that compliment, but more, I think, the nature of how this test, when you truly understand it, becomes a thing not so much of mystery, of just unexpected, anything goes madness and chaos, but rather a much more ordered, a much more precise and predictable event. And that means you can beat it. So this is what we saw, and this is exactly what I expect you guys should anticipate going forward. To help you then to better prepare yourself for the reading comprehension, and someone asked me about this in the chat earlier, so here you go. Let me give you guys a few resources for free that are out there as well. We did a couple of podcast episodes on reading comp. The first was just about the digital LSAT, where we talked a lot about what it's like to deal with a passage on the computer, or back then maybe the tablet. How do you scroll? How do you highlight and use the tools? How does the scratch paper work in conjunction with the interface? We talked about these skill tests, and we did a webinar on that as well. As you can see, one like tonight, where there were a lot of visuals and interaction and chat and stuff. I really recommend these guys. If you struggle with reading comprehension, especially if you struggle but don't know why, these skill tests are amazing. Please go check these out. So get into the podcast, get into the blog, find these resources. They are absolutely incredible. And Jack, you've timed your question well, because what I'm going to do is hop back into the chat, and I'm going to let Dave take you guys through the third and final section, which is logic games. So Dave, when you're ready.
John, I'm always ready. Let's move to logic games. So someone had asked me about the May 2020 test explanations, and it's very interesting because I find that test to be fascinating. And I've started explaining the May 20 logic games on our free forum, our LSAT discussion forum. So I'm going to reference that a little bit tonight as I go through this discussion. But when we talk about looking at LSATs and predicting what is on the logic game section of an LSAT, we always want to focus on what you're most likely to see on your test. And the reason is simple. If you know you're going to see something on every single exam, or you're going to see a lot of it, you should spend more time on those topics and preparing. And when it comes to logic games, there are 2 definite breakdowns in terms of what you're most likely to see and what you're least likely to see. So let's just briefly take a look at that. Let's look at the most likely column here, where you see basic linear games, which include sequencing. You see advanced linear games, so kind of like multiple stacks. You see grouping games, and then you see the combination of grouping and linear games. Now, if you go and count all the game types on all the LSATs out there, no matter how you slice and dice it, what you discover is these basic types, which is really just linear and grouping and their various combinations, they are the overwhelming games that you will see. In fact, when we look at the last couple of years, 97% of all games were one of these 3 types. As we've looked at the flex tests, this has been basically 100%. I'll talk a little bit about, a kind of an exception that's not really an exception in just a moment. But on the flex test, one of the things that we said was, because this was a new format, that they would have to go middle of the road and keep things really kind of, I'm not going to say vanilla because difficulty can come in any flavor, but they'd have to keep the game types rather straightforward. And that is exactly what they have done. So the funny thing, though, is when you look at these least likely types of games, and I'm going to come back to these as well, you see circular, mapping, and pattern. Even though these only occur once in a very rare while, they cause a lot more fear. And so it's natural to fear that unknown thing, that thing that is not normal. Whereas just another grouping game, you think to yourself, it might have been hard, but I know what grouping is. I understand the principles. And so what happens is, for a lot of students, they fear these types of games on the right-hand column and spend a disproportionate amount of time on those. We'll come back and talk about them at the end of this segment of the discussion. But what I want to talk about more so is what you're probably going to see on your test and what we also saw on the May 2020 test. And the first most basic rule is spend your preparation time focusing on linear type games and grouping type games. Get good at those two basic ideas, those two skills, and that will carry you through the majority of every single LSAT that you encounter. So, keeping that in mind, and if you are thinking, well, I spent a lot of time on pattern games, make sure you spend a lot of time on grouping games this week or on linear games. Keeping that in mind, let's take a look at a typical section here. When we look at the 4 games in given sections, this is the average of what we will see. 2 grouping games, 1 basic linear game, and 1 advanced linear game. Now, that doesn't mean that every test falls into that, but that is the average over time. So as you look at this, these are the skills that LSAC is saying they think that you should have mastered, and they're going to test you on them repeatedly. They're giving you a crystal clear signal. You better be good at these because they are coming. Every test has got grouping or linear on it, and sometimes they throw them together in the same game to really see if you know what you're doing. So as we look at the typical section that we encounter, 2 of the games are grouping, 1's basic linear, 1's advanced linear. When we look at the May 2020 test, let's see how that stacked up to this so-called average section that we're looking at. And again, the blue bar is the average over time. The orange bar is what was on the May 2020 LSAT. So take a look at how May 2020 stacked up to what we expected and really what we told people at our last crystal ball you're going to see. Yeah, it's nice. 2 grouping games, a basic linear game, and then an advanced linear game. And that's not the order that they were presented in, but it is exactly as expected. And I think what John and I are going to do most likely is that we'll probably release a podcast later this week that covers the May 2020 LSAT. We'll try to get that out before Thursday or Friday if possible. And as I mentioned previously, I've started explaining those games in writing for those of you who prefer that mode of learning as opposed to listening or visual. So when we take a look at this, the flex tests have been right down the middle for the most part. And this May test was exactly that. It was precisely what was expected at that time, relatively middle of the road. Now, how about some of the more advanced features that we work with, such as templates and numerical distribution? Let's take a look at how those play out over time. All right. So again, you see some statistics at the bottom of the screen here. But the one that really jumps out to me is the one at the top. More than half of the last 36 games featured a template kind of approach or a numerical distribution at its heart, or both, as the case may be in some instances. And whenever we have this discussion, I say the same thing over and over and over again. Look for these ideas. They are going to test you on it all the time. Look for rules that limit what is going on in a logic game so that maybe the best approach is to show a few scenarios. That's the template approach. And then look for the spread of variables to spaces or relationships that are similar to that reveal numerical distributions. I'm going to link to a podcast at the end of this segment of the discussion that will cover how to show templates and how to identify that. And if you're not comfortable with this skill, you have to go listen to that. You have to get comfortable with it because you are going to see it on the next test. It's coming up on every single exam, so you have to be prepared for it. Now, you see some of the specific numbers down below, and I'll just leave those for what they are. There's a lot of this stuff is what that really says to me. Doesn't matter what the exact number is, whether it's 33% or 19%. What's happening is there's a ton of this stuff on each test. Let's take a look at the May 2020 LSAT and compare it to this chart right here. All right. Now, once again, the blue bar is the historical average. The orange bar is what happened on the May 2020 LSAT specifically. Now, it's interesting here. You see a little bit of a difference. And I kind of laughed about this when I ran across it because I was like, now there's a little bit of an exception. And I'm going to talk with some specificity about what happened on May 2020, but I'm not going to reveal the game names, or which order it was. But two of those games, the best approach is to use templates. And I feel very strongly that if you don't, it sets you up to fail on that section, or at least to do worse than you could do, because the other two games are a little bit messier and take more time. So if you can use templates on the right games, that will actually save you time and allow you to do the other two games in a more relaxed fashion, although is anybody ever really relaxed during the LSAT, but at least in a less time-pressured manner. Now, as we look at numerical distribution, one of the things that we can say is that there wasn't a game that featured a specific approach to numerical distribution. But the thing that made me laugh about this was that the other two games that weren't template games, they each featured an unusual numerical relationship at the heart of the game. And you had to recognize that during the setup. And it wasn't overly challenging, but it was central to solving the actual game itself. So as we kind of look at this situation, even if a game doesn't have multiple numerical distributions, and that's what we use as the arbiter of whether or not it's a distribution game in most cases, it still means you have to look at the numbers. And when we go back and look at some of the prior released LSATs, there are a ton of numerical distributions on there. So as part of your preparation, make sure you're comfortable with the idea of showing templates or full solutions for the game, and make sure that you understand the idea of numerical distributions and how they work. It is absolutely critical that you do that. All right. What about the questions that we run into? In a sense, when we take a look at reading comprehension or logic games, we try to figure out what kind of direction they're taking. And is it something that just pulls from the globality of the passage of the game, or is it something that makes you do specific work and go inside the passage, or make kind of a miniature setup that takes additional information and forces you to figure out what's happening from that? So in logic games, global questions are the ones that come from the overall setup typically. After you've made your setup, they'll say, which one of the following cannot be true, or which one of the following must be true, and so forth. So they're about your big picture understanding of the game. Local questions force you to work with variables and see what happens when T is third, for example, or when Q is in the adult canoe, or whatever the case might be. So when you take a look at the typical logic game, it's actually very close to 50-50. Usually about 12 global questions and 11 local questions. And this varies a little bit by a couple each time, but this is pretty close to what they do on most LSATs. So once again, knowing that it's about 50-50, what did they do on the May test? And again, blue bar is historical average, orange bar is May 2020. And you can see something interesting happen here. The number of global questions dropped way down, and the number of local questions jumped up by a few. And if you go look at that test, as hopefully you get the opportunity to do so, it's because of the nature of the questions, or the nature of the games themselves. Even the template games, you were able to go in there and they said the templates were open enough that they didn't ask you global questions about it, and they made you locally put in conditions such as if T is fifth, which of the following has to be the case. So that's close enough to our range of variance to not get too excited about. And when you look at those games, there's nothing in there that would make you think that this is different or unusual in any particular way. So again, everything we've seen on the Flex test has been pretty standard. As we move forward, everything we expect will remain relatively standard. There's going to be a lot of grouping. There's going to be a lot of linearity. You're going to see a sufficient number of global and local questions. At least a third of each test is going to be global or local, and then the other will make up the remainder. Let's go back, though, for a second. We opened by talking about what's most likely to appear, and I said that I would return to this outlier type of idea. I want to come back to that really quickly. We already talked about the most likely and the 97%, and I was hopefully pretty clear about spend most of your time here. This is the majority of it. But if you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, look, I want to make sure I'm covered on all bases, that I have anxiety over getting caught off guard or blindsided, as it were, this is where that 3% comes in, that circular mapping and pattern. And I said before that it causes more concern than, it actually seems to work out. I will say this, what's the likelihood of this kind of appearing or something like this appearing going forward? Had you asked me this question back in April, I would have said on the new Flex test, there's no likelihood whatsoever. There's no way they're going to put something weird on a test format that is already completely different than what we've ever seen before. But now we're like 5 exams into this. They're starting to get a little bit more comfortable. They're starting to feel like they understand the format. They understand how the percentiles are working as clearly as they're ever going to. And so I think now the chances are actually starting to rise a little bit more. I'm not saying there's going to be one, but probably sometime in the next 4 Flex tests, there's going to be something that is a little bit unexpected and is more of an outlier. Whether that's a circular game or another pattern game or what have you, I don't know. But I can tell you that on the last LSAT, there was a form of the Flex test that had a game widely known as the Shredder game at the very end. And the regrettable thing about the Shredder game is it featured a shredder and a press and a riveter, but for a lot of people, it did in fact shred them. And it was a tough section. And that game was a little bit unusual. It was certainly weirder than any other LSAT game that we'd seen on the Flex. And when John and I talked about this afterwards, we said, look, that game was tough, but the first 3 games on that section weren't tough. So the section as a whole balanced it out. But I do think there is a fair chance here that at some point in the next several tests, we're going to see something unusual come up. So if you're not familiar with these games and you're not comfortable with them, let's take a look at a list that shows all the ones that have shown up recently. And we'll send you a link to this webinar after this is all completed. But if you want, take a screenshot of this, because that way you can be like, all right, I can find any one of these games and it falls under these particular designations. And you may see some of these that have little asterisks at the very end of the game. That means that the game is nominally in this segment, but probably has a more dominant piece elsewhere. For example, this game right here, Prep Test 88, which was the September 2019 LSAT, had a game about artifacts, 7 of them in a circle. But it was really a linear game when you broke it down, and it was best to do that game as linear. Same thing with some of the other things here. PT 79, that's the virus game, which is so much of a linear game, even though it uses a mapping feature to kind of discuss it, and so on. So as you look at these, this gives you the ability to go out and be like, am I good at pattern games? Well, let's go test them all. Am I good at circular games? Let's make sure I'm familiar with every single one of those. I will point something out to you, though. When you look at the history here, if you put all these in order, what you discover is that from about 1991 to 2003, these outlier games were rather common. And you notice a lot of the prep test numbers like prep test 1, prep test 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. You see all those in a row like that. They were throwing outlier games at people constantly back then. And it wasn't that the section was terribly difficult overall, because the other games were reasonable, but there was always something weird in that era, kind of like the early 90s to the late 90s. And then when they hit 2003, they just stopped. It just didn't happen for a long time. And if you start looking at the prep test numbers in here, you'll see a big gap after about prep test 41. You don't see anything after 41 in 50 or 60. You don't see it again until you get in the 70s. And what happened was from 2003 to 2014, they just didn't have them. They went into a really standard mode. And some people freaked out. They're like, that's it. Outlier games are done. They're never done. LSAT plays the long game. So for them, 10 years of not testing something, that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means it's a great new opportunity to try it out on a group of people that don't expect it. So when we look at this, what we started to see is in about 2014 or so, and you see over here on the pattern side specifically, you start to see more of these games coming back, and there's a slow return of these. And now it's not as common as it was in the early 90s, but it is definitely something that they feel very comfortable doing. And I feel as if we're probably going to run into something that's a little bit unusual in the next couple of tests. So be aware of that. I'm not trying to freak anybody out. That's not the goal here. Again, get good at grouping and linearity, and you will be in charge of the vast majority of what you might see. And keep this in mind, even if on a Saturday in January, the first game happens to be something unusual, by Sunday night, that game might be gone. You don't know that you're going to get the same section because it rotates constantly as you go through it. Now, let me close out my segment of Logic Games here by noting that if any of this sounded, a bit challenging or unusual, for example, I saw somebody say they didn't know what templates were. We've talked about this on our podcast, and it is something that we really pioneered a long time ago with the Logic Games Bible and our courses, talking about templates, and people have taken that into different directions. But there are podcast episodes here that cover all sorts of helpful topics, and I would point you to episode 21 because I think this is super helpful in understanding how to recognize templates. And then also episodes 45 and 54, which talk about how to become faster at Logic Games. And it's a 2-part series there. And if you want, you can also go back to 31 and 37 and look at those game section. And I hope later on this week, as John noted, yes, I'm creating our schedule for this week. We hope to do something like this for the May 2020 LSAT Logic Games section as well. All right, so that is an overview of what we're expecting to see. A lot of linearity, a lot of grouping. There's going to be more templates, there's going to be more numerical distributions. Focus on those, and it will take you far. And that brings to a conclusion here our discussion of just the content of the test. But we're not done yet. We've got more to talk about. And for that, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to John.
Oh, we're not done by a long shot, my friend. Although I will say, Dave, thank you. I know for a lot of you out there, that's a lot of information to digest, especially all at once, back to back. And we move through it with a degree of swiftness. But we do that in part, guys, because remember, this is being recorded. You're going to all get a link to this tomorrow. So if there was any portion you missed or maybe didn't fully get your head around, nothing to fear. Just go back and look through it. If you wanted to screenshot a page and missed it, you'll have it tomorrow available for you. We'll post this up on our blog and things in the days ahead as well. 2 things. The first is, in a world at a time when everyone's desperate to predict things, that's all I'll say about that. At least we have this, guys. At least we have the substance and the ability to look at months into the future and say with complete confidence what it is that you can expect to see, what you're very likely to encounter, and how it is that you should stagger and prioritize, essentially stratify the priorities as you study for these upcoming flex tests. There's a tremendous amount of comfort that you should take from that. On the flip side of that coin, I know a lot of you, having watched the chat the past several minutes as Dave talked through the games, especially some of the outlier games and good old Shredder, I know a lot of you are probably, understandably, a little bit jumpy for what that might mean for you going into November and beyond. The virus game has come up a few times, as have some pattern games and things. So what I want to do is transition out of this discussion of specific test content and our predictions for what you will see, and hopefully give a bit of a salve to you, cool the burns that some of you might be feeling, by talking a little bit about what the test makers do ultimately to try to balance the scales, how they can put a thumb on the scales to even out overt instances, objective instances of difficulty. So here I get to come in after Dave's sweet burns and hopefully pour some water on them. Let's talk a little bit about how it is that the test gets scaled. In other words, how the test makers ultimately come on the heels of this and take tests that are different in difficulty and equate them, make them equivalent to one another, so that regardless of which test form you get or which test administration you take, ultimately you can trust that it was a fair and, again, equitable experience from you to others. And I want to start by just looking at a single scale here. This is what one of the most difficult tests and one of the loosest scales that we have seen in recent years actually looked like. The original, taken from September 2019, so a very recent test, PT 88, the original is over here on the left. You'll see that I have every number through the 170s up to 180 included, and then just to get it on the screen, I break it down into increments of 5, the score in the middle in blue. And you can start to see how it works, how many questions you have to get, high or low, and they differ sometimes, to get a score. So if you got 73 or 74 right on this particular test out of 101 total questions, you got a 160 in September of, well, last year. If you got 90 right, you got a 172, and on up from there. The way that we tend to talk about scales, and you hear Dave and I do a lot of this in the days right after each LSAT, is based on this number here. The marker that we use is the 170. On this particular test, you could miss 13 questions and get a 170. That is a fairly loose scale, a generous, if I could ever use that word for LSAC, curve, as we would call it. It's a fair number of questions you can ultimately miss, more than 10%, to still get up into the top couple of percentiles here to 170. But what happens with the flex? What happens when they drop 25 or 26 questions out of this and still want to convert it to these same scaled outcomes out of 180? And the answer over here is a flex version of this same September test. So you can see over here, to get that 170 on a flex form, you don't need to get 88 anymore. You need to get 65. It converts it up. And the process of this, I won't get too dense into the mathematics, but it essentially works around a percentile. 88 out of 101 is a certain percentage of questions. That same number, that same percentage of questions out of 75 should produce the same scaling. So I was asked earlier in a chat comment if I thought that the algorithms that we use are in fact accurate. Do they represent what LSAC is doing? We'll know more about this when they finally release that May test curve that we've been talking about. But for now, yes, I find them to be extremely accurate, extremely reliable, because this has got to be the way that they're making the two different tests equivalent. 54 questions or 73 or 74 questions, both would produce a 160 because, again, they're out of different totals. So what was I talking about before then when I was saying that tests of different difficulty get offset or balanced, equated by different scales? And the answer, as you can see, I think is best illustrated as you look at two different tests side by side. Coincidentally, the two tests that I'm going to use are that same one from September of last year that we looked at, and the next one, what was until very recently the latest test we had, which was November of last year, November of 2019. Same number of questions, 101 or so, but as you look down, you will see that there are very different numbers to produce the same outcomes. 88 originally to get a 170 in September. 91 it took in November. You had to get 3 more questions right in November. Back-to-back tests here. 3 more right in November to get the same 170 score. Put a different way, in November you could only miss 10. Why the difference? Why a 3-point difference at that particular scoring point? And the answer? September was a harder test. More people performed worse in September than in November, so in November they tightened the scale. And the reason I think this should provide some comfort, maybe you sleep a tad easier tonight knowing this, is if you do happen to run into one of those brutal games, or as we've seen on a lot of the flex tests, some really complicated, difficult reading comprehension, there's going to be a balancing factor after the test is over. Other people are going to experience that same difficulty, and the test itself will be more forgiving. And you can see it on the original, as I said, but you can see it at various scoring points on the flex too. So consider a 160. You could get 56 right for the November version of the flex for a 160. On this, you only needed to get 54. So again, there's a forgiveness built in to offset the difficulty. And I think that's a fascinating idea. One of the things that we did to try to help people with this, because the vast majority of tests out there right now are, in fact, out of 2 sections of LR, out of 100 or 101 questions, is we built our own calculator. We built it for you. We've made this public, and you can see the link down here where we actually store this. What you can do is you can create, guys, your own flex tests. So if you have a 4-section LSAT, drop one of your logical reasoning sections and take the other 3 back to back to back. Calculate 2 things for each section. How many questions were in it? In this case, I've added some numbers for us. 26 for LR, pretty standard 27 for reading comp, and 23 for games. And then go and tally up your what we would call raw score, simply how many you got right. This person's done pretty well, as we will see. 23 out of 26, 25 out of 27 in reading comp, 22 out of 23. And what this calculator will automatically do for you is it'll convert this raw score from Flex, which again, if you count them up here, is 70 questions, right? And it'll give you a raw score on the original scale. So imagine we had done this for the 2 tests that we had just looked at. Imagine that we had gotten about 70 right and it told you that's a 93 on the scale. If you go back and apply that 93, watch what happens. 93 over here. September, look at you go. That's a 175. 93 over here. November, oh no, it's only a 172. That is how big a difference, guys, a test's individual or unique scale can make. That's where the difficulty, again, gets offset, gets compensated for. So use this calculator, guys. Go to this site, build your own flex test, get used to what it's like to take a test in this format, but know that you can get an incredibly accurate predictor of what your score would be, again, through a tally like this and then a comparison to the original scale. I hope you don't see that much fluctuation. What should happen is November to December, your raw score should change as the difficulty changes. But that's the way that the scaling of the flex works, and that's the way that we're converting people's flex scores into a reliable scaled score that you can then use to predict your outcome. So a very cool feature. And yeah, Sarah, if you missed it, that's exactly what I just described. Question count by section, question number right by section. The calculator will give you a total raw score that then, for whatever test you took, you can simply plug in to the original scale. The raw score in the sample I did was 93. You'd have gotten a 175 in September. You'd have gotten a 172 in November. So that's the way that that works. And Jamie Lee, I will absolutely put the link into chat, and you've timed it well because I'm going to actually turn it back over to Dave to take us home tonight. And guys, if you've stayed this long, if you're still with us, congratulations. There's a reward coming your way. Dave?
That's right. We get to the good stuff now. Although I think what we just talked about with the test content and the scale is super useful. But one of the reasons that the crystal ball is kind of like maybe one of our most well-known webinars is because in the past we have made some very interesting predictions that turned out to be correct. For example, in the July 2018 LSAT, we correctly predicted that they would use February 2014, a test that had kind of a difficult circular game. And so a bunch of our students were able to go out beforehand and do some circular games and make sure that they were really comfortable with it. Can't always do that. And as I talked about back then, it was a very unique set of circumstances that allowed us to make predictions that specific. But we kind of want to get into that same vein. It's been a while since we've had an opportunity to talk about this, and so I'm going to try to get a little bit specific and try to follow along with me. Hopefully everything is going to make sense here, but if not, throw a question in the chat, and I'll certainly try to come back and hit that, if not now, at the end of this seminar. But this is the section that I've been waiting to do all night because I love to talk about what do you think they'll do next. We've talked about individual question content, and we know what's going to appear, a certain number of flaw questions, a certain number of grouping games. But let's take a look at each of the 5 LSAT-Flex tests that have been administered so far. We've got May, June, July, August, and October that are floating around out there. And what you see below is a couple of different things. This first row is going to be very interesting. And I'm going to point out what's really happening here is that in this particular row, these are the prior non-disclosed test sources that they use to create this test. I'm going to come back to this repeatedly. But what happens is this, is when you go to put an LSAT together, if you're sitting in LSAC headquarters, what that means is that you go ahead and you look at tests that you administered before and you look at those experimental sections. And those experimental sections get put together and then reused on future tests. Sometimes an entire test is non-disclosed. For example, a Sabbath test, some accommodated tests from the past, international tests from the past, and a lot of February tests from the past as well. And so there's a ton of sections out there and tests that people have taken that have never been seen. They've been reused at times, but they've never been seen publicly. What's been happening with the Flex tests is that they have largely been mining many of those prior usages. And so in this very first row, you see all those usages. All right, so I'm just going to make note of that. I'll come back to it. You can also see in this second row the predictions that we made about the curve, depending upon what your combination was. And if you think about missing 7 or 8 to get a 170, it's very close to missing, say, 10 or 11 to get a 170. And you notice that the first couple of tests, just like we thought, were really tight. They were very limited. There weren't that many options here. And then as we've gotten up to August, you saw that August increased from missing 6 to missing 10. And a lot of people said, well, why did they do that? That's because it was the biggest of all the administrations. They had more possible combinations than anything that had ever been done before. There were 54 possible combinations in August, and all those combinations had different scales, some of which corresponded to so-called easier tests, so the scale was tighter, and some of which corresponded to harder tests, and so the scale was looser. And when we came back to October, that was somewhere to 7 or 8, maybe 9, depending upon the test. Hard to tell with that shredder game. And then this last row down below is the overall impression of the test that you saw. And if we go back and we take a look at this, we also know that when we look at May 2020, we have part of that test now. They have released 3 of the sections that were used. And I find that to be really interesting because we can take a look at what they actually did with part of that May test. Not all of it. There were other people who didn't have any of those 3 sections from the May 2020 LSAT. And that is kind of, you think about what's actually going on and you go back to the beginning of this pandemic. The way I look at what LSAC was thinking was, okay, in-person tests have been canceled. We can't have the tests that we planned to have in March. We're now scrambling. They did an amazing job by actually creating an entirely new test form and test delivery system. And they came into May 2020, and I'm pretty sure that what they did was they used what was originally going to be the June 2020 LSAT. Maybe it was the March one, but probably was the June one. And that's part of the reason that they released that test this time. I think this was part of the original June test that they planned to release all along. And so when we started pressing on them saying, hey, you guys, this will be the first year in like 30 years that you haven't released an exam, they were like, well, let's just release it. So when we look at that exam, where did it come from? Well, they used a couple of different sources, but they used some experimentals that have been tested relatively recently. And you can see that that range of time correlates to the prep tests that were released from the 87 through 89, the most recent of prep tests. So the very first one of these flex tests was from the 80s prep test era. Now, as the pandemic went on, all of a sudden they realized, oh man, we got more tests that we have to make. In fact, we've got several more. And even though they would only announce them a couple of weeks in advance, they kind of knew that this was coming. I think everybody could see what was going to happen. And so what did they start to do? Well, they started to cast about and say, well, what tests can we use for this? We just used our June test. And so they went back and they said, well, what are the big tests that we have that have been given to a lot of different students? Where can we get more exams that have a high number of test takers so the data is really good? Well, as we'll see in a moment, the February LSATs for years have not been released. They are non-disclosed. And so here we get to June of 2020, and what tests did they use? They used primarily the February 2011 and February 2012 LSATs, exams that were administered 8-9 years ago and never released and occasionally reused, but they went back and they used those. And that era is the 62 to 66 era that's in there. Now, they get to the July test, and they're still like, man, we're running out of material. We don't have a tremendous amount. What should we do? Well, and John and I talked about it the night before. We're like, man, they just did February 11 and February 2012. I wonder if they're going to do February 2013. And it showed up that week. Of course, it wasn't enough because July was a big test as well, getting bigger. So they pulled in the January 2020 international test, something that hadn't been seen by North American test takers. But again, that was a lot of 60s LSATs. This is why a couple months ago, if you went on most forums that talk about LSAT, you saw people saying, yeah, they're pulling from the 60s. And I would see those comments and I'd try to say they have pulled from the 60s, but that is unlikely to continue. And so as they got to the August test, here now, this is the fourth LSAT. They're still running low on material. They have enough, but they're running low. What do? They go to some more February LSATs. They go to February 2015, and now they pull out February 2017. And they also pull out a September 2016 international test. And you can see they've moved into the idea of the prep tests in the 70s and the early 80s. And so you kind of see like a growth arc here. And the reason they love the Feb test is because it is a big administration from the past that has been taken by thousands and thousands of test takers. The statistics are 100% reliable, but the exams are not disclosed. No one has ever seen these. But on some of the cases, like February 2014, we know what the content was. That circular game, so we were able to warn people. When we get to this final test, the October test, look what happened again. Lots of February usage. In fact, the usage on the October test ranges all over the place. And what that tells me is they are really starting to search far afield for content. I don't know that the well is dry, but the well is certainly getting drier. And so there's not a whole lot of free tests out there. There's more than people think, but there's not a whole lot of ones that have been taken over and over again. So if you look at this really quickly, started off with something really recent in May, completely in line with what you'd expect. Then they went back in time and started mining earlier tests, bringing them forward. That is really critical to understand as we take a look at this. So the first thing is I'm just going to put all those tests in order and take a look at it right here. We're going to isolate the main test sources. And the reason I'm doing this is people always ask me, what era of tests should I study? Should I study the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s? Which prep test segment should I study? And if you look at this, they started here and then they went back through here, brought it back to the present. This is unlikely to pop up again anytime soon. They've used a lot of the tests in this era. If you are out there studying this week, study the 80s LSATs. That's the first kind of thing. So having mixed it together is excellent. That gives you a really good range and a really good feel for some of the subtle differences between tests from different eras. But you'd have to expect that they're about to go back into the 80s again. So that's the first conclusion right there. This is our expectations. We're about to see a non-disclosed test from the relatively recent era. Now, as always, when I'm looking at this kind of stuff, I ask myself, can we go further? And I think that we can here. Maybe we can get even a little bit more specific. So despite the fact that there's a really wide range of tests that are being used here, let's go and actually take a look at something that I think a lot of people will find pretty interesting. This is not every non-disclosed LSAT. There are Sabbath administrations, international administrations, and accommodated administrations out there that are also non-disclosed that could be reused. However, for these flex tests, they've shown a very high desire to want to use exams that have been thoroughly vetted and checked out before. And the best exam for that would be major administrations that were non-disclosed, typically in February. Now, hopefully everybody's still with me on this. I know it's a long, long thread and a long, long story, and we're almost done here. But let's take a look at those February tests. And this is the kind of thing that John and I spend our time with daily, where we're like, let's look at some LSATs and see what they've done with it. And we've created amazing spreadsheets and flowcharts that show all of this information. And I don't think anybody has anything remotely similar to what we have. So let's take a look at those Feb tests. February 2011. Well, this was already used on the June 2020 Flex. February 2012. This was used on the July 2020 Flex, as was February 13. Also, they mixed them through June and July there. Here we come to February 2014. This looks like the first test in quite a while where it's like, maybe this is the one that's coming. Here's the problem, though. This is a test that actually was already used relatively recently. This was the test that we predicted they would use in July of 2018. It is the test that has the circular game on it. Could they reuse it in November? I don't think they're going to. And part of the reason is this. This test wasn't used just in July of 2018. It was used as a test in September of 2016 in Asia, in September of 2017 as both an accommodated and Sabbath test. And they also used this as the February 2020 Sabbath test. So they've used this test this year. So when I look at this test right here, even though it's the latest big test, I don't think they're going to reuse this anytime soon. Maybe towards the end of this stream in April, we could see this come back, but I don't think so. Well, let's keep on going. How about February 2015? Sorry, they used it in August of 2020. February 2016? Well, they used that in October of 2020. Hopefully you guys are getting where we're going at this point. How about February 2017? Nope, they used it. So now we come down to this group of tests at the very end. And we've got February 2018, January 2019, and March 2019. Now, there are non-disclosed tests from early 2020. They're not going to reuse a test that they used in February of 2020, so I'm not even going to consider that. Let's take a look at this. What about February of 2018? Has that been used at all? Well, nope. It's floating around out there. It has not been reused. How about January of 2019 and March of 2019? These tests are possible, but I will say this. They're both relatively recent. So as we talk about November specifically, do I think that these are likely to show up? No. Although they haven't been reused recently, or they've never been reused, they're so recent that it seems very unlikely that this is a test that they would just throw into the last big test of 2020. I think these two exams at the bottom, the January and March 2019 LSATs, are very likely to be reused in 2021. A lower chance in January, certainly increasing as it goes on in the year. So if you're taking a later LSAT, these two definitely could be on the agenda. But out of all these exams, it's the February 2018 LSAT that is the most likely to be reused for November here. So knowing that to be the case, the obvious question is, what do we know about February 2018? The good news, it was not a crazy test. There was nothing completely wild or strange or terrible about it. It was very normal. And remember, the November LSAT-Flex is given over several days. So even if you get part of this test, you were probably going to get parts of other tests. But this exam was pretty reasonable. The games were exactly what you'd expect them to be. There's some basic linear, there's some advanced linear, and a couple of grouping games right up the alley of what you want. How about the reading comprehension section? Very typical from, the 80s reading comp. The reading comp was a little bit tougher. There were a couple humanities passages, one science passage, and one law passage. So, if you're out there and you're comfortable with, say, reading about copyright law, that was one of the passages that was on this exam. There was a science passage about beetle larvae. There was a passage about lying. So this is the kind of stuff that you might see on the test that you take in November. But the best news from this isn't, oh my gosh, I need to go study copyright because it's just too broad of a field. The best news is it was pretty normal. Now, one of the questions that has come up several times tonight is, do you expect this test to be harder? Or is there an idea that this exam will be harder? No, there's not. When we looked at the August test, it was clear that there were so many people taking that test that they were a little bit worried. They appear to have made that test a little bit harder, and you saw that the scale that we predicted had a really wide range. This is a smaller test, and so I don't think they're as worried about having to pound people and keep the percentiles as rigid. And so when you look at this November test, it probably will be pretty close to the middle. There'll be some versions that are a little harder and a little bit easier, but the scale will offset. But ultimately, we expect this to be a lot like the 80s test. Maybe the reading comp will be slightly harder, but this should be a fair test, and you're very likely to see parts, if not all, of the February 2018 LSAT in there. So hopefully that makes everybody feel a little bit more comfortable. If you're out there, take some practice tests from Prep Test 80 to 89. If you can, take that May 2020 LSAT. And hopefully that puts you in a position where you feel comfortable and you're not worried about getting blindsided by anything crazy that is going to come up here. And so that's a long haul. I appreciate everybody being here. I'll make a few comments about some of the things that we have going on around this, but hopefully that gives everybody a really comfortable idea of what they might see on this exam from both a specific section content, from the era that these tests could come from, and even a specific prediction about the test itself. So on that note, I'm going to run through a few slides here that talk a little bit about some of the stuff we've got going on right now. And the first is our Stuck at Home sale continues. And after I talk about this, I will take live questions from the audience and try to answer anything that we didn't get to in the chat. But if you're taking one of our courses or you're buying our books or you need a tutor, there is a set of discounts on that. These have never been equaled. They never will be equaled again. But as long as we're all stuck at home with this pandemic, I'm going to keep that going on. If you are studying on your own, keep in mind that we have a self-study site that allows you to input your test information and get your results processed. It's not digital, but it is self-study. For our digital stuff, we've got our analytics site where you can take any LSAT that's out there. We've got 50 flex tests that you can take that automatically score themselves. So there's a lot of options there. And if you're looking for a course, if you're taking the January LSAT or one of the later LSATs, bang, we've got you covered there as well. And these are all discounted as that very first slide has set up. And then near and dear to my heart, admissions consulting. We're in the throes of the admissions season. It's just getting really heated up. If you need help with your essays, your addendums, your, talking about your LSAT score, your GPA, your personal statement, we can help you with that. It's one of my favorite things to assist our consultants with. I talk to a lot of people about admissions. I think it's one of the most valuable things that we do. And if you have any questions in general, contact us. We're on all sorts of different social media platforms. I'm on Twitter, on Reddit, so is John. You can hit us on the LSAT forum. We're there all the time. And obviously through our podcast as well, we are happy to help. So on that note, and on behalf of John as well as Adam, I'm going to sign off on the recording, but we're going to stick around and take some questions. I want to thank everybody so much for lasting through this. We knew it was going to be a long one tonight because especially the last couple sections really are very involved. But thank you very much, everybody, for being with us. We truly hope that this was worth your time and helpful to you as you go forward with your preparation. And if there's anything we can do to assist, please let us know. We'd love to help. Thanks so much. Have a great night.